Hey everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. I hope you are doing well, and I hope this video finds you having a great day. In this video, we are going to go over the different judicial philosophies, particularly the two main types, judicial activism and judicial restraint. These two philosophies are considered to be complete opposites of each other, but of course there are varying degrees of each. Ideally, justices or judges are supposed to be objective, but there are many factors that influence the way they rule on cases. Among the many factors is their political ideology. Before we go into these judicial philosophies, we need to understand the concept of judicial review. The definition of judicial review is the power of the judiciary to review laws and governmental actions to see whether they conform with the Constitution. If they violate the Constitution, the court has the power to overturn them. So this came from the ruling in Marbury versus Madison in 1803. Keep in mind that judicial review is not specifically spelled out in the Constitution. This ruling is considered to be the most important Supreme Court ruling of all time because it shored up this power for the court, a power that we most closely associate with the Supreme Court nowadays. As we consider judicial philosophies in regard to judicial review, consider this question: how much power should the courts have? This is a constant question that is often asked. First, we are going to go over judicial activism. Judicial activism is a judicial philosophy with the belief that the courts can and should go beyond the law to consider broader societal implications of its decisions. Judicial activism is a loose interpretation of the Constitution to advocate for contemporary values and conditions. They oftentimes see the Constitution as a living document that should be routinely reinterpreted for modern situations. Judicial activists tend to be less concerned with precedent than judicial restraint judges. Remember, a precedent is an earlier ruling by a court in which future rulings are supposed to be measured upon. They also tend to be more likely and eager to overturn legislation. Judicial activist judges sometimes use their own feelings to strike down laws that they feel to be unjust. In recent decades, there has been more and more examples of judicial activism as the role and scope of the government in society has increased. So what are the pros and cons of judicial activism? First, for the pros or the good stuff about judicial activism. Defenders of judicial activism say that interpreting the Constitution and laws must change with the changing times. So again, they see the Constitution as a living document which should constantly be updated by interpretation. Courts can right the wrongs of executive and legislative action. So if the executive and legislative branches would get something wrong, they would be able to right it. Now for the cons, detractors of judicial activism charge that it undermines the power of the elected branches of government and the state and local level governments, and therefore is undemocratic. People elect folks to make laws, and they don't think judges should be overturning them. In the same spirit, judicial activists are often accused by opponents of making laws from the bench and basically circumventing the legislative process. For some examples of judicial activism rulings, probably the best example would be Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954, where the U.S. Supreme Court overruled the earlier precedent set by Plessy versus Ferguson. So this basically ruled separate but equal as unconstitutional and overturned segregation in public schools. Roe versus Wade is another great example where the courts ruled that abortion had to be legal in all 50 states. In other words, it was decriminalized, abortion was decriminalized by the Supreme Court. All states had to have abortion be legalized, and states could determine to which degree abortion would be legalized. The peak of judicial activism was during the civil rights movement between the 1950s and the 1970s, where a lot of the notable Supreme Court rulings were in the spirit of judicial activism. Now for judicial restraint. On the other hand, judicial restraint is limiting the power of judges to strike down a law. Judicial restraint is a theory of judicial interpretation that encourages judges to limit the exercise of their own power. It asserts that judges should hesitate to strike down laws unless they are very obviously unconstitutional. Though what counts as obviously unconstitutional in and of itself is a matter of debate. Judicial restraint tends to be more constrained by precedent. They tend to allow states and local level governments to create their own laws. Judicial restraint philosophy oftentimes takes into account what the intent of the framers was. In other words, what would the framers respond to this legal question? Generally speaking, judicial restraint judges tend to think that change in society should be more incremental or slow and should be handled by the elected officials of the executive and legislative branches and local and state governments. The high tide of judicial restraint was between the 1980s and the early 2000s, when many judges were trying to rein in the expanding power of the federal government. So in closing, remember that judicial philosophy is not the same as political ideology. Whereas in political ideology refers to liberalism and conservatism, some people like to use the terms interchangeably of judicial philosophy and political ideology, but we really should not do that. Sometimes judicial restraint is referred to as strict constructionalism because it favors the strict interpretation of the Constitution. Sometimes judicial activism is referred to as loose constructionalism because it favors a looser interpretation of the Constitution. So also keep in mind that it is quite possible for a judicial activist to be conservative and vice versa. While most judicial activists tend to be more liberal, that is not necessarily the steadfast rule, just as most judicial restraint justices tend to be more conservative, but that, again, is not the universal rule. So I hope this video helps you better understand judicial restraint and judicial activism and the role that judicial review plays in our court system. So I hope you have a great remainder of the day. Let me know if you have any questions about what you saw on here.